few more people coming on. If you can start, Shona, I'll just keep admitting people while you introduce.
Okay, do you want to start the slide share?
Sure will.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know that this is very early for some of you who are joining from all over the country. My name is Shona Vaz. I am the current chair of the APPIC Board of Directors, and many of my colleagues and I are here today to present our first workshop in a very long time that is designed for academic DCTs on preparing their students for internship. Jeff, I think you need to switch the display settings on your Zoom.
And display.
The top left-hand corner. Do you see that display settings?
Yes.
So if you,
Duplicate, slideshow, swap.
no, swap present. Yep.
How's that?
Swap present. There we go. Thank you. 2 years into this, and I still have errors whenever I start a presentation like this. So thank you, Jeff. We can move on to the next slide. So I am going to have our panelists introduce themselves. But before we start, I just wanted to speak about the first person on this slide, Dr. Alison Oswald, who is APPIC's past chair. And this was her brainchild, if you will. She conceived of this last year during her term as chair and from requests that she received through CCTC. And Alison organized us and led the content and isn't able to be here today. So, so we feel her in spirit and know that she is here with us, but I did want to thank her for all the work that she did. All right, I will let everybody else introduce themselves. Jeff, do you want to go first?
I do. I think I've clicked everything I can click. So welcome, everybody. Glad you're here today. And I think we've got everything set to go. This meeting is being recorded. Just to remind you, there will be a link available later on to those who request it and to as a video that they can watch. So we hope that's successful, and we hope there's some great tips in here for you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Kylan, APPIC Match Coordinator, former training director at the University of Texas at Austin Counseling Center, and really glad to be here and really glad that we're doing this. I'm very excited about this project.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Hill. I am currently the APPIC Vice Chair and serve also as the APPIC Coordinator. So you've probably seen emails from me over the years. In my day job, I'm at the Stanford University School of Medicine, and I am the DCT of the PGSP Stanford Society Consortium. So I have a unique vantage point of having my feet, well, in the weeds as a DCT, as well as serving on the APPIC board where I get to have the complementary perspectives of the internship training directors. So that is how all of my presentation is informed.
Thank you, Kimberly. Jeff, we can move on to the next slide, which is a little bit redundant. We don't need to talk about Zoom etiquette as much. You are all muted. Please put questions in the chat as we go along. We're going to be monitoring it. If we can answer questions in the chat, we will. But if that's not possible, we will save them till the end. We have about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you are speaking up at the end, please remember to unmute and to turn your camera on. We all know that it is hard to speak to a screen of black boxes. So we'd love to see your face when you ask questions. And we will have slides that will be shared with you after the workshop and available on the website. Thank you, Jeff. Next slide. a couple more housekeeping items. Our learning objectives are up here, so you can get CE credit. So we expect that you will be able to name 2 elements of APPIC policies that apply to DPAs and are relevant for your students, that you will be able to describe steps in guiding your students through internship, and that you will be able to identify 2 APPIC resources to support your work as DCTs. Our next slide just gives you a rough outline of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to start by just talking about what you do when they land with you. I will talk a little bit about FIT. We'll go on to talking about the APPI, the match, how we can facilitate communication between DCTs and internship training directors, match policies, problem consultation, and then we have time for questions. So this is a 3-hour presentation. We have 2 5-minute breaks scheduled. All right. Thank you, Jeff.
I just want to say you have to be present for the majority of this session to get the CE credit. There will be a SurveyMonkey evaluation sent to your email address that which you registered for, and you will be able to download your CE certificate from that. Sorry. That's it for me. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. You can stop sharing, and Kimberly, you go next.
Okay. So in thinking about prepping this workshop, I was hoping that it would provide even well-seasoned DCTs with at least a handful of nuggets to take away. And then our DCTs who are brand new to this, sufficient information, but not too overwhelming. So that's kind of the sweet spot I was aiming for. So this first part is really about what you do before the fall of internship application, because internship guidance starts from maybe not day 1, but definitely year 1. So one of taking an evidence-based approach to this process can be really, really helpful. And so if you have data from your program, meaning access to students now that have recently applied to internship, one thing that you can do, if you are not already doing it, is start collecting data on where did they actually get interviews for internship. I have found this to be incredibly helpful. I have the history of our interview in the history of our program. And I was really able to see not only some training gaps, but also just some really nuanced competencies that certain internships were looking for, such that then I could guide future students on whether or not it was worth their time to apply there. So, for example, there's a VA that we're, have a good track record with matching, but it's not a good match for all of my students. And so I did a little analysis on who eventually matched there. And I could see for this site, there was an average of the folks that they actually interviewed had a mean of 7 research products. And so for my students who didn't choose to focus on their extracurricular time on research, it was just really easy to give them that data. And then they, even though they really thought, well, I'm a good fit, look at their clinical training goals match mine. I was able to give them this data and save them money and time. And similarly, there's another VA where I couldn't quite understand the pattern of who they would interview and who they wouldn't. So then I did a quick analysis of the students who they did interview, and I could see, of the students who are applying, the ones that they choose to interview had a very specialized and pretty intensive assessment focus, even though this wasn't listed in their brochure. And so this was really, really helpful, and it's helped me guide the students going forward. So It's also for our data nerds, it's kind of fun project to do along the way. So many students wrongly expect that they can start prepping to apply to internship the summer before they apply. As I said before, you really can start providing mentorship as early as year one. That will really help them match with a good fitting site down the road. So with early guidance, thinking about practicum selection, one thing that we see with students who go unmatched is sometimes they have fantastic training, but it's really, really quite specialized too soon. And so training directors give feedback that what they're really excited about is broad, strong core foundations in these clinical competencies. And so just don't over specialize at the expense of breadth. It is worth noting that there's a few practice areas that really do particularly value experience in specific settings. One of those I've noticed over the years tends to be college counseling, for example. That's not true for all college counseling sites, but more so than some sites, it seems like that is a pattern. And so you can help your students know that early on, that if this is an aspiration, you might want to look for that. If they have choices in their practicum selection, you can guide them that way. Certainly, if they want to go child or neuropsych, you're certainly going to want to guide them to get really strong foundational competencies and assessment early on. This last bullet point is, as much as we can, I know we all encourage our students to think broadly with geography when it comes to applying to internship, and really truly be able to be in the privileged position to apply to internship based on their training goals. But sometimes personal life gets in the way, and some students really truly are geographically restricted in a certain area. And oftentimes I've noticed that they know that from day one. You know, they have children in elementary school, a partner whose job is their dream job. They're not going to relocate. And so I start having those conversations early on, because you can be fairly strategic in seeking practicum opportunities that are going to best develop competencies that are most valued by the practica in that restricted geographic locale. For example, if college counseling is the only game in town, you highly focus energies on developing competencies with emerging adulthood, crisis, those types of things. Selective service. So this is something I never thought of until last year, even though I've been doing this for a long time. I would say the first week of graduate school, make sure that your male-born students who are US citizens check the ss.gov website to make sure that they are registered for the selective service by the age of 26, in case they develop an interest in applying for an internship that requires it, such as the VA medical centers. The reason I thought of it last year was because one of my students matched with a great VA, and on the Friday before he was supposed to start, he was notified that he lost that position that was supposed to start on Monday because he didn't register for the selective service. He's a great student. He just thought it was automatic. So, when talking to Greg, who's been watching these sad, tragic stories for many years, it's sadly not that uncommon. It happens every couple of years, Greg?
Yes, every few years we have one thing or another, whether it's that or background check or drug testing. Yeah.
So that's something you can do early on, especially because if they don't do it by 26, it's too late. So if they're entering at age 23, 24, there's a small window there. Coursework guidance. In talking to internship training directors, there's a less focus on the coursework specifically, in that trust the graduate programs to provide the broad-based foundations and clinical competencies. However, there are some geographical areas that really do value specifically Rorschach coursework. So I always recommend that my students who have an aspiration to land an internship in New York to strongly consider both taking Rorschach coursework and getting some Rorschach experience. That does not apply to all New York or Boston, Philadelphia sites by any means, but certainly there is a little group of sites out there. So to increase your chances in a really competitive area, that's something I recommend. Practicum hours tracking. So as APPIC coordinator, I'm not sure there's a day that passes that I don't get an email from a graduate student somewhere about how to track hour X, Y, or Z. So, just provide in-house trainings to your students to track their practicum hours in ways that are consistent with the APPIC hours categorization rules. What I really hate is it's October 20th and students write me from a variety of programs and say, oh my goodness, my DCT won't verify my hours. Or for example, a really classic one is, I thought I had 33 integrated reports, but it turns out my DCT says there are really only 5. Is that true? And blah, blah, blah. So, and I'll go into the integrated report definition in a bit, but it's just good to start early so there's no surprises at the 11th hour. Time to track tips. So if your students use time to track, and last time we checked, over 91% of doctoral students in the match reported using, or they didn't report using, the actual time to track data shows that 91% of the applicants are using time to track. One of the things that really causes headache down the road for students is when they're listing the activity type from week to week, if they fail to actually, so they say they go in and they do an individual therapy hour, but they forget to attach it to an actual client, it won't get logged in the right way, and it won't record, it won't categorize the demographic variables, the setting variables, those types of things. And this causes a lot of stress at the 11th hour when they're trying to get their hours verified and they're not meshing with what they are seeing in another section. So make sure, we worked with time to track to add little pop-up windows to make sure that students are doing this. So it has improved, but it's just something I think it's important to help the students remember. Students should regularly monitor their face-to-face clinical hours using some type of tracking system. Although 90% of the students are using time to track, it's not required. Students can use any hours tracking system they prefer. There's no magic. The only benefit, using just a good old fashioned Excel spreadsheet. There's a way at the end when you're applying to internship to just enter your summary hours into the various categories. The only advantage of using time to track is, well, not the only advantage, just the most significant advantage is that it is directly linked to the APPIC, and you can click a button and it populates the hour sections. Very common question I get as APPIC coordinator is, what counts as face-to-face hours? And particularly in the time of COVID, what's changed, what's staying the same, that type of thing. So what counts as face-to-face, video-based telehealth has counted for decades, I think, at this point. In February 2020, perfect timing, right when COVID was hitting, we approved clinically focused interactions with patients that are conducted over the telephone, those count as face-to-face. So this wouldn't count if you're just talking to your patient about setting up an appointment, those types of administrative tasks. But if it's an actual intervention or assessment, you can count that as face-to-face, either intervention or assessment. What doesn't count, so at this point in time, text-based telehealth services do not count as face-to-face. The field's just not quite there yet. We did a public comment about that in, I think it was January of 2020, I believe. And then observing another clinician or supervisor, I get this question a ton because it's a very common training model, a developmental training model. And the key here is they're trying to measure the student's intervention and assessment experience. And so if you're strictly observing another clinician or supervisor doing an intervention or assessment, then you can't count that. You count that as support. But if you are more engaged in a hybrid kind of co-therapy model where you are engaged with a client in that intervention or assessment, then you can count that time. It's kind of, I think of it as like a co-leader of a group. We never even question that. And a lot of times you're watching your co-leader in action. So that's the way I think about it. So it's kind of like a group leader, but for an individual session or an assessment.
Kimberly, we also had another question in the chat about phone therapy counting since March of 2020.
Correct. So that's the second, So that's the second blue bar that interestingly, we had passed that through public comment. We had decided to go ahead and approve telephone-based telehealth prior to the onset of the pandemic, and we were going to roll it out a year later. And then COVID hit, and we decided, let's move now. And so it just moved it forward. So there's no intention to remove that. That's nothing's ever permanent, but at this point in time, there's no thoughts about letting that go.
There's one other question. You may have covered it. I was looking at the other side. How do students record group activities in time to track with client naming?
So actually, Jeff, I think it might be really useful. Having done a lot of Q&A on the APPIC and these types of things, there's so many nuances. I feel like we might go down a rabbit hole if we go into too many of the specifics, but we have left a lot of time at the end for Q&A. So I'm hoping let's save those for then.
Okay.
And if we don't answer your questions, anyone can always email me at kimberlyhill@stanford.edu, and I'm happy to answer those questions. So I know all of you are aware of how not for every doctoral program, but for a lot of doctoral programs, really establishing great practica that have robust assessment training. It's not the easiest thing to track down, and internship training directors are really noticing it. So they're talking about how they've really noticed a decline year to year in both the quality and quantity of assessment experience over the years. You'll, in what they're seeing, for example, they might open an application, somebody has, 200 assessment hours. Granted, hours are not the all and be all, but one would conclude that, oh, okay, they had a pretty decent sized amount of assessment experience. Then when they really get into the nitty gritty, they see that they've reported 85 hours of feedback on weekly outcome measures that they've been giving to their psychotherapy patients. And it's just not the assessment that typically they're looking for. So just something to be mindful of is sometimes I think they hurt themselves by thinking more is better. And then it actually irritates training directors when they think they're getting one thing and then they just question the judgment of the applicant when they write in 621 BDIs, and it's just kind of, the APPIC is really, really long. And so just guide your students to be thoughtful and use good judgment about how they're capturing their assessment experience and knowing what the nature of the section is about. Of course, this decline was exacerbated over the last 2 selection cycles with the onset of the pandemic. So many communications with students, DCTs, about the concerns about how is this going to impact our students' ability to match. We did a lot of communication with internship training directors to let them know this was coming. And many internship training directors adjusted their hours minimums, let them go all together. And they know that they have a lot more assessment work to do on the internship level than they used to have on the assessment front. And since the match rates did just fine this year, and it was the lowest assessment hours in history, I think, in recent history, I think it's evidence that it's okay. And so just keep telling your new your students who are applying this year, it's going to be okay. Okay, these are really common assessment questions I get as APPIC coordinator. Can I count the time the patient is completing a self-report measure, such as a BDI? And so the answer to that is no, because you're not spending any time while they're sitting there completing the 21 self-report checklist. So you can list the BDI as an assessment measure that you administered, but you can't count any time associated with that unless during COVID, you were reading the BDI to them over the phone. That would be a slight variation. So those types of things. Can I count the time spent providing feedback? Yes. So this does count. So, you give an MPI and then you're giving them the results, those 15 minutes or however long, count that. Can you count the time spent administering assessments as part of class? No, practice assessments are really important, but they don't count it for the APPIC in a practicum assessment hour. Get this one a ton. I have a clinical research position or a job as a psychometrist. Can I count these assessment tools and hours? Only if you as DCT sanction it as a supplemental practicum. So about half my students get these types of jobs, and about half I sanction and half I don't, because they don't have the training or supervision in place that I think is sufficient to call it a practicum. It's more of just a job and they're not supervised. So I'm not going to count it as practicum hours. And then lastly, does assessment tool X count as an allowable measure for the APPIC integrated report definition? I get this a ton. So this is what happens out there in the field is student X asks practicum supervisor in the community, oh, we're doing this assessment in your clinic. Does this count as an integrated report? And by Webster dictionary definition of what an integrated report is, the practicum supervisor answers yes. And so the student then starts entering into, that they've done integrated report X, Y, and Z. And this is where that 11th hour tragedy happens, where they think they have 35 and in reality they have 3. And it's coming from a good place because yes, it's an integrated report. But so often you'll see somebody do an intellectual assessment and some type of symptom measure like a SCID. And technically, by this APPIC integrated report definition, which hasn't changed for, I think this was the same definition when I applied to internship 20 years ago. And so I like to provide this early. I go over it every year, even though I've showed it to the students. In year one, I go over it every year because there's always these tragic stories, even after I go over it. And most of the time, people, it really is those symptom measures like SCIDs, PCLs, CAPS, these types of things that throw people off. So in terms of tips early on about written materials, so several years ago, APPIC limited, you can only, internship sites can only ask for 2 types of supplemental materials, a case summary or an assessment report, or 2 assessment reports or 2 case summaries. So a tip to give your students early on is to don't wait until the summer before you're applying to go back and try to get reports from, it turns out maybe your best integrated report happened in your very first practicum in the summer after your first year. And sometimes trying to go back into a facility where you no longer have access and trying to get it cleared and de-identified, such a challenge, tons of stress at the end. Highly recommend that you, to students, that they polish their reports all the way through as though they might have to submit this for their internship application tomorrow, and to ask their supervisor if they can de-identify and take it with them. They will love themselves later. Always good to keep your CV in shape. I always ask advisors to please edit them for them. So they're going to need 3 letters of recommendation for internship. It's surprising sometimes when you're evaluating somebody who didn't get a lot of interviews, some of their choices for who they asked to write letters, and maybe 3 research supervisors or a research supervisor and 2 classroom instructors. And for this task, really choosing the letters who can best speak to their clinical competencies is key. For certain sites, you definitely are going to want to have a research, someone who can really speak to the research competencies as well. Another tip is, practicum supervisors who are going to write your letters down the road, not just practicum supervisors, but letter writers, they're going to get annoyed with our students if their interactions were with them in year 1, and then they haven't heard from them in 3 years, and then September comes around. Can you write me a recommendation letter along with the other 15 people that you need to write for? So I always like to encourage our students to cultivate those relationships with their letter writers throughout their time in grad school. Stay in touch, let them know how they're doing. That will help them down the road. The standardized reference form is going to be in a new format this upcoming cycle. I'm going to go over that in another section of this. Always wise, and most particularly very wise this season, that you circulate the SRF to the practicum supervisors and letter writers early, so that if they are writing in certain areas where you have to write a letter recommendation to apply to practicum, if they can start writing the letter in the SRF format, they'll love themselves later because they're not having to reinvent the wheel. So download a copy of the SRF, send it to them in year 1. They can have that letter in that format all the way through. This is just a very bare bones timeline, and these dates were from last year. But these are just some of the major tasks once we're actually in the summer, fall of application year. Number 1, please have your students sign up to receive match news. This is the only way that Greg and I, as match coordinator and APPIC coordinator, have to communicate with applicants. Suggest you all do that as well. I have students send a CV and an initial site list. Shona's going to talk about the fit in creating a site list, but I personally feel this is where most students go wrong. They apply geography, apparent cachet, all sorts of odd reasons. And so I do a lot of rounds of feedback on site lists with students. Request a recommendation letter 6 weeks, at least 6 weeks before they're due. Prevent a lot of distress down the road by checking your transcripts for incompletes early on. Then we have a dissertation proposal defense deadline of September 15th. We set that date because until you propose, you're consumed with proposals and you can't really think of internship. And if you have about, I found the sweet spot of having at least 6 weeks of intensive time for internship applications on top of everything else going on is sufficient. So that's why we set September 15th. I have them send me the penultimate site list for feedback, order their transcripts early on in case they get lost. They can be sent email, through a digital service, paper, all sorts of ways these days. Always ask them to send their penultimate essays and cover letter to a mentor for feedback. And then October 1st, we have them submit their APPIC for DCT verification, give sufficient time for feedback loop. Then after I've seen all of this, their site lists, their essays, their cover letters, and they proposed, then I give them official approval. This is just my program, but then I give them approval to register for the match. This one saves them money, saves them $130 if they are not ready to go. It also, in all of the different ways that your match rates are displayed, including APPIC's documentation on the website, it will influence what your match numbers look like if they're registered and then they don't end up participating. So I make them have official approval before they can allow them to register for the match. And I have them shoot, October 20th for their November 1 deadlines. One thing that internship training directors are really reporting is that, wow, we get these really polished, beautiful internship applications. And it's clear that doc programs are doing a really great job of supporting the internship applications. And then they get here and their clinical interviewing skills are quite rudimentary. And so highly recommend doing mock interviewing with faculty. And I think Greg's going to speak to that a little bit more later. I also schedule a ranking meeting with each of them. So it's surprising how often students are like, oh, I don't really want to live there, and just not fully appreciating that there still is a match imbalance. And just really talking through the consequences of either ranking or not ranking a site, or what site X may, the impact that might have on their career trajectory. And then submitting the rank list by a certain day and match day. And I believe.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Yes.
I just wanted to say there were a lot of questions about the definition of a job and a supplemental practicum and whether those hours would count. So I feel like we need to put that at the top of the list for the Q&A.
Okay, great.
I am going to crash Kimberly's slideshow here and talk a little bit about fit from the perspective of the internship training director. In my day job, I am the director of training at the University of Chicago Medical Center. And I've been in this position for about 15 years at this point as the associate director prior to where I am right now. And so we have these conversations all the time with our externs. We have about 50 externs on site and host several events during application season about helping them apply for internship. So thank you, Jeff. So I just wanted to say, as a training director, as an internship director, I'm sympathetic to you all in terms of how busy it is in the fall. I know that your busy season comes right before ours, and there's so much reading, reviewing, writing, advising, and sort of helping them manage their anxiety. So we all feel that, and just wanted to express solidarity. I think that one of the challenges for you all is managing several different timelines, and depending on the size of your cohort going into the internship application process, there are different requirements. And so there isn't really a formula that works for everybody with a one size fits all, because they're so varied in their abilities, their experiences, their goals, and the types of sites that they're interested in, and also how competitive they are for each of those sites, which goes back again to the level of competitiveness. Next slide, Jeff. Thank you. So, when I'm advising externs, one of the things I say to them is, this is you are part of this process. And so I like to say, you're the captain of your ship, and now you're charting your course. And so before you embark on this journey, if you will, ask yourself during the next year, what do you want to do? What do you want to learn? What do you have to offer to sites that you're applying to? Where do you want to live? And I know we'll come back to geography. And what sites meet your needs in terms of compatibility with your training goals? And I'm going to speak to each of these a little bit. So the first thing that I say to students is that what they think of as fit might be different than how the internship program views fit. So students will read programs brochures and get really excited about all of the cool opportunities that they think that they might want to have. And so they frame fit as, this program offers everything that I want. So all the experiences they want, whereas as internship training directors, we view fit as a combination of overlap and some similarity between what they've done before in terms of the setting, in terms of the nature of the work, and what they want to learn. So that is a really key piece for us in terms of the being able to help them refine their skills, rather than to have most of the internship year being focused on them building entirely new competencies. Students also think about where they want to live as a variable that is super high on their list. And again, we try and encourage them to think more broadly and to focus on sites that are going to give them both breadth and depth. When we were prepping for this webinar yesterday, one of the things that Greg said was, you want an internship training director to read your cover letter and to think, wow, this student, based on their experiences and how they describe them, is going to do really well at our site because they have so much to offer and we have so much more to teach them. So the question for us really is, if you came here, could we meet your needs? Could we help you accomplish your training goals? And if you matched here, would you be happy? Thank you. Next slide. So helping students select the list of sites as a DCT can sometimes be a challenge, because students will find many sites for which they think they are a great fit. And so Kimberly alluded to this already, but I just wanted to kind of break it down a little bit more and encourage your students to take an evidence-based approach. So the first source of data for them is to look at a program's match history in the directory. The directory has data for the past 3 cycles for every internship program. And by looking at the data, you can tell whether programs take students from particular types of programs. So for example, all programs are required to report whether they take PsyDs, PhDs, EDDs, clinical counseling, school combined. So all of this is going to be in the directory. As an internship training director, every year I get emails from students, August, September, saying, I'm really interested in your site, but I see that you have not matched with the counseling PhD in the last 3 years. What do you think about whether I would be a good fit? And my answer to them is, yes, we will review your applications, but if you look at the odds, I'm telling you, beyond the last 3 years, we haven't matched with the counseling PhD in the last 7 years. So you may want to conserve your resources for a site where the odds of you matching are higher. The minimum requirements are also in the directory. So the number of hours and whether there are any special experiences that might be required for the site. We talked about the Rorschach earlier. There might be other particular types of training experiences. The competitiveness and the selectivity of the sites is also available. And this is the ratio of the number of positions to the number of applications received. I wanted to add a caveat with this, which I share with students, and that this number is a little bit deceptive because the sites often have different tracks. And so you just add all the numbers together in the directory, and it isn't really divided up by track. So for example, I use my site as an example. We have a general adult track, a general child track, and then an adult and a child pediatric and adult neuropsychology track. So we have probably between 200 and 230 applications. 110 of those are for our adult track. So while it looks like it's a really competitive site for the 5 positions, your chances of matching to one of the other 3 tracks are much higher because we receive fewer numbers of applications. So to that end, you want to encourage them to look to your program's history. So as the DCT, you're charged with being the historian for your students and providing them with data. So your program's interview history, where have your students done really well? Your program's match history, where did your graduates go? There might be particular labs in your program that overlap really well with what's offered at certain internships. So encourage them to kind of look at your alumni network, to look at people that your faculty might be collaborating with who work in internship sites. And all of this will help them make connections and understand the data more effectively. And many programs in their brochures will provide information about previous intern cohorts. So we list the programs from which our previous interns have come. So they can actually go into our brochure and look at where what programs our interns came from. So they can then make this decision for themselves about whether we're a good fit or not. Thank you. Next slide, Jeff, please. Helping them finalize their site list. So you want to encourage students here to apply to a range of sites in terms of competitiveness. As Kimberly said, you might have to do some reality testing here and rein students in a little bit, which is sometimes disappointing and hard work for both you and them because you're helping them to manage their expectations. Certain types of sites are more competitive than others, especially depending on the type of program that your students are coming from. With regard to geography, I'm sorry, we're sort of, beating this dead horse over and over, but you really want to encourage them to cast a wide net. And if they focus on location as the most significant variable, what happens is that they often will be compromising fit. So I really like the idea if they know that they're going to be geographically restricted for internship to start to prepare for sites that are locally available early on. The other thing I say to students is that sites on the coast and in major urban areas tend to be more competitive just because they receive more applications and there might already be existing connections and networks in those areas. So, I live in Chicago. There are 8 PhD programs and 6 PsyD programs just in this city, with probably about several hundred students in the practicum market each year. And it is a challenge to find students who, in my application database, there will be students from Chicago, and some of them will be known to us in terms of the practicum sites that they were previously at, and some of them were not. I'm not saying that this matters, but just make students aware that there are wider networks. And then for most students, and Greg might speak to this a little bit, 15 is an ideal number of sites, give or take a few. There are APPIC data for years show that there are diminishing returns with regard to matching, and applying to more than 15 does not significantly increase your chances of matching. The more applications you have, the greater the potential to make mistakes as you're submitting those applications, and also to manage interviews can be challenging. So if you have students who are applying to more than 15 sites, ask them why, and have a really good reason for why you're supporting that. From an internship training director perspective, we will all tell you that fit is most important, and the notion varies from site to site. Students who have previous experience in a range of settings will have more options, and so encourage students to consider programs that offer a blend of what they have in addition to what they will learn. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the cover letter as a medium to highlight fit. So tell them to take their time in preparing materials and look over these with them very closely. Next slide. We have a couple of slides here on training director data that were gathered by APPIC last year after the match. So 400 and some training directors completed APPIC survey that asked them to identify the most important factors for interviewing and ranking applicants. And so we asked them to rate on a scale of 0 to 5. So that's up here on the y-axis. And on the bottom, you have the variables. And you'll see that fit was important for both interview and ranking. Interview is in blue, ranking is in red. And so fit was most important. The absence of professional conduct issues was the second most important factor. Commitment to culturally responsive practice, experience, quality of essays, quality of cover letter, whether they had passed their comps exam, and training in evidence-based practice. So these were the top factors. And then the second category is the next slide. Jeff, can you move on? So you'll see here that the number of intervention hours is less important than the quality of intervention hours. The same is true for assessment. So the actual number varies, is less important than the quality. References, dissertation progress, academic preparation, all of those tended to be of less importance. The data for all of the variables we considered are on the APPIC website under the tab that says Surveys 2021. So I am going to stop here because it is almost time for our 5-minute break. And I did want to add that those differences are really very marginal, as someone noted, which is why we wanted to just, on the PowerPoint on the website, you'll see that we identified the top factors and the bottom factors. And really the top ones are all about fit. I see lots of questions in the chat. I'm assuming we have saved them till the end.
They're predominantly the paid job, like 80% of them are the paid job. Yep.
Okay, great. Was there anything that I needed to answer before we took our 5 minutes?
I don't think so.
All right. So we will see you back at 11:02 Central Time.
All right. So now that we've gotten our students through the first few years in the program and through the actual fall of applying and creating those site lists based on fit, I want to venture into the world of the APPIC itself. Okay, so these APPIC tips really predominantly come from my work as the APPIC coordinator and just the copious questions I get about that from all the various stakeholders. So a couple of things I'm just going to repeat, and sometimes, you know, hearing it 3 times is when it really encodes. So I think general APPIC tips, remind them register for the Match News. This is our only means of communication with them, and there are sometimes really time-sensitive news that comes out that we just need them to see. So a very simple thing, but it's not uncommon to get a DCT or a student write me freaking out that something's not working on the APPIC portals, and just a reminder that it really does function best on Chrome or Firefox. So if you're using a different browser and you're having trouble, try Chrome and Firefox before you reach out to APPIC support. It just might save you an hour. At any point now that the new portal has that cool reapplicant feature, students in year 1, you can go in there and start entering your information, see what type of information it's going to be asking you for at the internship juncture. And that information won't be lost. And so when they do eventually apply to internship, they will have the ability to, each tile will ask you, oh, this is what you entered, do you want to keep this? So you have the ability to just go in and play with it now and see what's coming. This applies to you as well. You can create a dummy APPIC. I definitely have one and utilize it to give tutorials to my own students. So on almost every page, if not every page of the APPIC, there's a link to the APPIC Applicant Help Center that has detailed answers to the most common questions we receive. 9 times out of 10 answers to student questions posed to me as APPIC coordinator can be found in the Help Center. And so it's a little link on every page. They've also, near the end of this past cycle, they added a nice, in addition to their phone support and email support, which is frustrating at times because it's grounded only in East Coast time. And so, you know, you got to be early if you're in Hawaii or the West Coast. And but now they have a cool chat box, a virtual chat at the bottom of a lot of the screens that students are finding really helpful. So general APPIC tips. So the sites will become visible in the APPIC portal on September 15th. That's the point where they can start adding them to their list within the portal. And that's when they can start attaching their cover letters or essays. This is when they can start identifying. So they've selected the Palo Alto VA. Now they can decide, you know, who are the best 3 letter writers for that VA? Okay, it's going to be Dr. So-and-so, so-and-so, and so. So then they can put in the emails for those 3 for that site. So you can't add any of those supplemental documents or identify letter writers for a particular site until you've actually added it to your portal. And that doesn't mean you can't ask your letter writers to write you a letter well before the September 15th, if you wish, but that's when you can actually add it. When they're adding programs to their portal, highly recommend that students double check that they've selected the right program by cross-checking it with the APPIC program member number. So this is a new feature we rolled out this year. It helped tremendously. I got so many fewer panicked phone calls that they applied to the wrong Rutgers, which has a number of programs. So you can search by, in the search functionality, you can actually search by APPIC program member number. So highly recommend students do that. It saves a lot of devastation down the road. I know you all know this, but we strongly advise people not to wait till 11 p.m. the night before the applications are due. I don't care what year it is, there's some phenomena that happens that's out of our control. And, you know, whether it's the 40,000 applications that are rolling in that weekend of November 1, that slows down the system, hurricanes, something happens. So, you know, as much as you can, I know it's tight as a DCT. I spent many Halloweens verifying an applicant, but try to aim to submit their applications at least 72 hours prior to the deadline. Something every year, this year wasn't quite as bad, but really remind students that all portals, the entire system is grounded in Eastern Standard Time. So the portals will close if a site has specified their deadline as November 1st, even if they're in Hawaii. It is 11:59 Eastern, it will close. And so I will get lots of emails at 11:45 in a different time zone saying, why is this close to me? This is my dream site. My career is gone forever. So just remind them of this multiple times. On the internship tab on the APPIC website, there's a lot of resources about the internship. There's one document that I think is really helpful to distribute to your students. It's actually a Q&A document. It's about 20-30 pages or so of the most common questions. It's stemmed from one of the Q&A sessions, but it's really does cover most of the common questions that I receive and a lot of great answers. So I always circulate that to my students. I think it helps. And I think DCTs can learn some things as well. So how did our enhancements go for this current cycle? Just some of the key, there was a lot more, but just some of the key enhancements this cycle. So we removed the gender items altogether, which was very well received. We revised the citizenship section of the APPIC to provide more flexibility for international students to capture their unique work eligibility status. So it was too focused on visa status, which is more of your key to the house rather than your ability to stay in the house and work. So we, it's much more flexible, and I actually don't think I can't think of a single panicked citizenship question, and there's usually a ton. So I think this was quite successful. I already mentioned the search functionality of being able to search for by internship program number. I think that helped a lot. The reapplicant feature it was just so nice that for the students who did have to go through the match again, they didn't have to start from scratch. All of their information was there and they could just choose whether or not they wanted to update it. So that was nice. And then this year is the first time we're still midstream, but rather than the students who are going through the post-match vacancy service after phase 1 and phase 2, they're now able to use the APPIC portals, and which has been nice for the training directors, most particularly in that it's all streamlined, it's all going into the same place, same format. But it was always confusing of, okay, you do this outside of the system, but in other phases, you can't do anything outside of the system. So it's just nice to have it more streamlined. So for this coming year, just FYI, there's no changes in the APPIC fees. And you can see to that question about how many students should, how many applications should students submit, we actually did the pricing structure such that we de-incentivize students from applying more than 15. And so it goes up significantly, almost doubles for every site they apply thereafter for $60. So what's new for this coming cycle? So the most significant, so most things are staying the same. There are a lot of little quality of life type enhancements of making this instruction a little more clear, aesthetics here and there, improving the functionality, speed, those types of things I'm not going to detail. So the experience should continue to improve for all players along the way. These are some of the more substantive changes. So the SRF, the standardized reference form, is actually not an APPIC product. It is a product, it's a joint product of the CCTC, the Council of Chairs of Training Councils, of which APPIC is a member. This spring, CCTC established a work group to revise the SRF to address some of the problems reported by internship training directors. I'm part of that work group. So some of the problems of the, some of the problems reported by internship training directors is that they really used to threw this around a lot, that it was like the wild, wild west in terms of what they were receiving as letters of recommendation. So for those of you who are new to this, the standardized reference form is historically has been a Word document or PDF that you upload. And so even though there was a format and specific questions to answer, many letter writers were not addressing those questions whatsoever, and or even creating their own form and answering totally different questions. And then also, it was quite difficult for training directors to get to the actual content they cared about. So complaints about 3/4 of a letter being about the letter writer themselves and only a paragraph about the applicant, only writing about the strengths and not addressing any growth areas as the form requests. So, so for this current cycle, the questions they're asking aren't really different, but they're going to be utilizing the functionality of the letters by liaison, such that it's going to basically force a letter writer to answer the questions. I can show you. Actually, are you seeing only my PowerPoint? Okay, so hold on, let me. So this is a playground environment. So student X will identify Dr. So-and-so as a letter writer. You'll receive a link to this. So then there's going to be some forced choice answers. So what's your primary mentorship role for this student? And there's several options: supervisor, dissertation chair, committee member, other research mentor, course instructor, other, and you can specify other. Then training directors were really curious. Okay, you were a clinical supervisor 4 years ago. So oftentimes we'll say, I've known this person for 5 years, but that doesn't really speak to when they knew them and the type of relationship they had. And so it's really, and also how to interpret some of their assessments of their competencies. So if they were a first year practicum supervisor, it'd be really important to know when they're talking about their clinical competencies, this is what it was when it was their first practicum. So you have your start date and end date. They can be approximate. This is not, does not need to be to the day of the time that where you had your primary mentorship role with that student. Then, some supervisors and some mentors have multiple roles. So you can talk about, oh, I was a supervisor. I was also their dissertation chair. And so there's 3 options for that. Then actually, so it would be easy for the internship training directors who get hundreds of applications and have a very constricted time to review applications, trying to break this out into chunks where they can quickly go to see what is most important. So here's a block where the letter writer can actually talk about the setting and activities that the student did under their supervision. Then there's actually competency text box where you have 1 for strengths and 1 for growth areas, and their forced choice. So this is certainly going to level the playing field in terms of, you're not going to be able to totally avoid writing about growth areas, and it will become more normalized, the fact that we all have growth areas and it's important to speak to them. Then there's an optional, if you just want to have a summary recommendation block, and then just a summary recommendation, Likert scale here. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about this, and I can appreciate that letter writers, we want to, I'll be working with CCTC to determine how to best communicate, get the communication going, get all of the DCTs and students access to this early, so we can distribute this to practicum, to whomever letter writers will be early on, so that they'll have time to adjust whatever letters they already have to this format. Again, the content itself isn't really different as much as it's just in blocks that will make it, 1, that make sure that people are actually answering them, and then 2, much easier for training directors to filter. So we'll really want to send a template out soon so that we can distribute that and get folks ready. The longer term goal is to really utilize this as a shift towards competencies. And so the current vision that's being discussed in CCTC is to shift the strengths and growth areas box into a relative ranking within that student's competency areas. So for example, student X, please choose their top 3 competency area, the strongest competencies for the student, and write about them, and then write about the 3 competency areas that are their relative areas of weakness. So it's not everybody's top, along the, because if we just shifted towards a competency rating on all, like you'd have everyone's top 1%. So the idea is to move to a relative ranking for that student. So that's a longer term goal, but that's where the discussions are right now. So that's the most significant change. And again, it's more of a CCTC project. And I think letter writers is gonna be a little bit of a pain point in just the change. So for us DCTs, the key changes for this cycle are going to be, we're going to have our downloadable Excel spreadsheet back for where our students have submitted applications, and you can click a button in your DCT verification portal. This is very exciting to have this back. Because we'll have this back, we're going to stop sending the weekly digest emails about where students have applied. Some people don't even get them because they go in junk folders. It's not, so I just don't think it's necessary to clog our emails with it when you can go in whenever you'd like and click a button and download and see in live time where your students are. Sometimes there's a lot of panic if students put a mistake in inputting the wrong DCT information, or there's been an unexpected staffing change and their DCTs can get locked, and it causes a lot of stress right in that last week. So now students have the ability to change their DCT of record up until their hours have been verified. So that's a nice feature. One of the questions that I've received a lot over the years is, what constitutes, in the DCT verification section, we get this question about what constitutes good academic standing from APPIC's perspective. So last year, we added this information in blue into the information section, the instructions about this item, but we went ahead and just embedded it into the question. So you'll need to answer this. And the key here is that we're focused on current functioning, not historical, but current. So is a student currently on probation or a performance improvement plan, learning developmental remediation plan? If yes, please explain their status and why you currently view them as ready for internship. In addition, please certify that you will only permit the student to submit a rank order list if their probation or performance improvement plan has been fully and successfully completed. So hopefully that's a little more clear. So for applicants, there's actually new functionality for internship training directors that will benefit applicants. So with the ban the box, there's certain jurisdictions such as New York City where it's illegal for many employers to ask about criminal history prior to making a job offer. So we now have functionality in the admissions portal where training directors can hide the criminal history items. And so that's really cool. I'm really excited about that. So currently the cycle, when an applicant is in their APPIC portal, they've selected their 15 sites and they click on that program. Within that, in that page for that site, it has a link back to the directory. And so it's a lot of clicking around to get back and say, what was that information about that again? So one thing that we're going to be importing directly is the program description, and from the APPIC directory, we'll have a lot more information embedded in the APPIC portal. So I think it'll enhance the quality of life for the applicants, just having a lot more information within the APPIC portal, because there's a lot of clicking around in this process. A common APPIC question I get from students is there a comprehensive list of everything we need to sign up for to submit the application? It seems overwhelming, but there's really not too many stops for the students. You know, they start with the APPIC directory where there's no, just to search for your sites. There's no login or registration required for that step. They start their APPIC at this link. They create a user and password. There's no cost incurred with starting the APPIC. Again, you can start that in year one. Once you're in your APPIC, there's under the psychology training experience tile, you just click on a button for the APPIC tab. It takes you to the time to track where you're going to enter your information about your practicum experiences. You will have to create a username and password. It can be the same one as you use for your APPIC. Once they're connected, you can toggle back and forth and it doesn't feel so clunky, but they do get connected and you don't need to pay. No one needs to pay for time to track just to use the APPIC. There's a whole different section, APPIC tab. So tell your students don't pay for it if they're not already time to track users. And then I add here, as soon as you received approval from your DC to apply for internship, then you go to the National Matching Service to use that link. So these are the 4 major stops for applicants. I get a lot of questions. I'd say the most common questions I get are about these two professional conduct items. The first one, have you ever been put on probation, suspended, or terminated, or have you failed or resigned from a graduate program, practicum, internship, or employer? I think the one that not trips people, but leads to the questions is, well, I resigned from a graduate program. I resigned from medical school. Do I need to report that here? Or I resigned from that practicum because I didn't like my supervisor. Do I need to report that here? And the answer is yes. And I think what's really important is to communicate that checking one of these professional conduct items is not the kiss of death. If you do a good job of explaining. Certainly, I've had many of my students start one career and resign from a graduate program because they saw the light and wanted to go with psychology. And it's not, so, go ahead and tell them, sure, go ahead and answer that question and just provide the text that explains it. The other item that I get a ton of questions, I know Greg gets a ton of these questions about, have you ever been convicted of an offense against the law other than a minor traffic violation? Most commonly, like an underage drinking possession, alcohol possession, it was expunged. The definition of expunged, does that mean it doesn't exist? I get a lot of those things. Honestly, I tell my students to seek legal counsel on how to best answer, because each of their situations is highly individualized, and I am not a lawyer. And this is their future, and you don't want them to match somewhere having answered one way and then losing their internship at the 11th hour. So that's typically how, and Greg might say more about that later. So I get a zillion questions about, how do I categorize this hour, this type of hour, this activity, this type of thing. And I saw in the chat, is there a way to get improved guide within Time to Track, specifically about how to categorize hours and code them, that type of thing? That's actually a passion project I'm working on right now. Is I'm working with Time to Track. I'm going to help them, because Time to Track wasn't an APPIC. It's still not an APPIC organization. And so they existed outside of the APPIC. And so some of the instructions don't map on perfectly to the APPIC. So I'm working on an APPIC hours tracking guide that will have a lot more specificity than what exists today. And we don't have enough time for me to go into all of the different nuances of hours categorization questions that I receive. But hopefully there will be time at the end if you do have any of these specific types of questions, and I can answer them, and you can always email me, and I'm happy to answer those. So I get DCTs will often write me like first couple weeks of October saying, how do I get to this DCT portal? And it's not as mysterious as it seems. It's your individualized DCT portal doesn't magically appear until a student actually clicks submit for DCT verification. That opens up your portal where you go, and then once it's opened, then you will see all of the students as they start submitting for DCT verification. So don't waste a bunch of time scouring the website trying to find where's my link to the DCT portal. It won't open to you until someone submits. Again, there's no reason for a DCT to need to have a Time to Track account to be able to verify their students. Sometimes if you do have a full service Time to Track account, there can be some confusion within the site about what email you're using for what role. So that's where support, the Time to Track support folks can help you with that. But you do not need to pay for Time to Track to be able to verify your students. I get this question, is a DCT, quote, letter needed? And that's just often what it's referenced, but there actually isn't a DCT letter. There is a text box within our verification portal that asks you to speak to the student's strengths and growth areas. I also get the question, what's preferred length? And I think it's a great question for our training directors on the call. But I think this is where, the more you write, the less people read. And so I think being very thoughtful and pithy and really truly trying to address both the strengths and the growth areas. So again, internship training directors complain, just like about the letter writers, that DCTs, they don't complain generally about DCTs in this section, but they do wish that more DCTs would write about the growth areas as well as the strengths in more depth. I personally felt really uncomfortable when I started doing this a few years ago. It makes me feel better. I make a big in caps qualitative statement of this is not an area of concern. This is developmentally appropriate. Somehow it makes me feel better, but I do put them in there. So don't forget to remind your students to apply for the Cynthia Ballar Scholarship, which is announced in the Match News. So the purpose of the Ballar Scholarship Program is to facilitate access to quality doctoral internship training for students facing financial challenges. This year, we awarded 100 applicants with $200 Ballar scholarships for a total of $20,000. We're going to be doubling our scholarship budget this year, and we'll be awarding a total of $40,000 to applicants. So that's really exciting. This is really tiny, I know, but so this is this year's awardees are winners. These are the doctoral programs that they are training in. So I don't know if you can find yours, but what I love about it is it's clinical psychology, school psychology, community psychology, PsyD, PhD, Canada, US. It's a nice representation. It's a random selection. And so definitely one of the fun parts of my role is being able to notify these winners. Oops. My Zoom is freaking out. Just popped me out. Okay, so APPIC related tasks after the match. Oh, what are you seeing right now? Is it black?
Yes. Black. End of slideshow. There you go. There's your contact information. There's Q&A.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you. So, so don't forget to upload copies of your student submitted APPIC for your records. So they won't be accessible after the cycle closes on June 30th. And, most often you're not needing to reference them, but sometimes it's fun to do an analysis of them down the road, or students will need it for something down the road and they'll ask you to have a copy. So it's great to I always print out a copy, throw it in their student file. I always survey my students about their experience, where they landed. I have the data of where they applied. I asked them where they landed interviews. I asked them, in the end, were there any sites you didn't rank and why? And that's also really informative about, and helps me guide students down the road of just maybe some training issues or cultural issues, things like that, that I don't think would be great for all students and that type of thing. It really helps me inform my program analysis and my future internship advising. We will be holding, like last year, some kind of open APPIC Q&A for applicants and for DCTs. I haven't set those dates yet, but we'll start with for the applicants in August and September, and we'll do some for DCTs in September as well. We'll put the details in the Match News. And then, of course, here's my email again for content questions, and contact me. And if you need APPIC support for technical support at, it's funny, it's appiccas.org.
Kimberly, we did have a question about the due date for the Villar scholarships. Those are after the match. I believe you solicit those applications.
Yeah, so the due date was different the first year than it was this past year. I believe it was February 1.
Or February 1.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it should be about the same time next year.
Great.
Right, Greg, you are up next.
All right, let me see if I can get my screen shared here. Whoops. Can you all see that? No, I'm having trouble. Are you able to see those slides?
Yep.
Great, great. Okay, well, I am going to jump in now and talk a little bit about the APPIC match and the post-match vacancy service. I'm going to get just a very, very brief overview. I'm not going to go over all the nuts and bolts. I'm going to assume that most of you have some exposure to this. But later on in my second presentation today, I'm going to show you resources. So for those of you who are new and need some of that more basic information, I'll show you exactly where it is on the APPIC website and the NMS website. So very quick overview. As most of you know, the selection process is in 3 parts. There is phase 1 of the match, which goes from October-ish through the middle of February. There is then phase 2, which goes from February through March. It's essentially a redo of phase 1, but in an accelerated fashion. And so that, again, February and March. And that's for students who still haven't been placed and for programs that have unfilled positions. And then the third step is called the post-match vacancy service, and that's where we are right now. We have listings of positions that are open. We have students who are still looking. That is more of a bulletin board almost type of service where sites post announcements of vacancies, students apply. This year was through the APPIC, and then instead of a match, it's the much more traditional offers get made and are accepted or rejected by the student. So that's basically what those are about. Okay, moving on. I want to talk to you just a little bit about supply and demand. I'm sure all of you have heard about this. This graph is a 24-year history, all 24 years of the match. The blue line is the number of applicants that participated each year, and the red line is the number of positions each year. And as you can see, we had many, many years of a great shortage of positions. The worst was in 2012. And as you can see, what has happened since then is that that huge gap has been essentially eliminated and has been for the past 5 or 6 years. We had a bit of an exception last year. We had an increase in the number of applicants and a slight decrease in the number of positions. So last year was a little bit more difficult for applicants. But that returned to, I guess, the place it was in the few years prior for this most recent match. And by the way, National Matching Service, that blip, that change that occurred in 2021 where we had that gap come back, they actually said that that occurred for most of the professions that they work with. So it sounds like that represents a phenomenon that's larger than just psychology. I want to show you essentially the same graph, but I've added an orange line, and the orange line reflects the number of accredited positions as opposed to all positions, which is the red line. And And as you can see, the gap between accredited positions and the number of applicants was even worse in 2012. In other words, there was only an accredited position for about half of all applicants. And as you can see, we've made substantial progress with that. But unfortunately, that progress seems to have come to a halt about 4 years ago. Not really sure why. But the growth in accredited internship positions has slowed or now stopped. And this is a phenomenon that began pre-pandemic, but I'm sure the pandemic has something to do with it as well. So as you can see, this is a shortage that remains and is something that we're continuing to focus on. Excuse me. Let me just talk about some tips, some of the responsibilities that we see for your role in this process. A big one is match registration. And this next statement I think is going to be obvious to most of you, but I want to say it anyway, is that your program has the authority to determine match eligibility. And the reason I put this in here is because you might be surprised how often I hear from DCTs who say something along the lines of, well, so-and-so, the faculty didn't believe they were ready for the match, but the student really insisted, so we let them participate. And I want to let you know that that is not okay. A student who is not yet deemed ready should not be participating in the match. And furthermore, you should let your students know in advance not to register unless they've been specifically authorized by your program to do that, as Kimberly mentioned. And one incentive for you is that when a student registers, they then become a part of your doctoral program statistics that APPIC publishes. So you really have an incentive to keep students from registering who really shouldn't be registering. Now, what happens if you're unsure if a student is going to meet your program's requirements in time to participate? For example, if you require comps to be defended, but that isn't scheduled till January, how should you handle that? What I recommend is that that you have the student go through the process, but they not register for the match. And they shouldn't register until they are eligible and they are sure that they are going to participate. And that is the best way to handle it. Now, if a student knows that they're not going to be ready until phase 2 for whatever reason, you should know that we only accept registrations for either phase of the match until the ranking deadline for phase 1. So if a student wants to participate in phase 2 only, they need to register prior to that ranking deadline in phase 1, withdraw immediately from phase 1, and then they will be able to participate in phase 2. Now, you should also ensure that your students register under the correct doctoral program, and that's a particular issue if you're at a university that has multiple doctoral programs in psychology, because sometimes students get confused. And we also ask you to monitor student registrations and to take action if there are discrepancies. Say someone from another program registers under your program, or if an unauthorized student registers, we want you to pay attention to that and take action. NMS does send you lists of registered students in December and January, but you can access that anytime from the NMS website, and we really encourage you, and it helps us a lot if you maintain that kind of vigilance. And on a separate note, just want to let you know that there is what we call a couples match. And what this is a special set of procedures for any two students who wish to participate in the match and to coordinate their outcomes, usually geographically. And it's for students who are in that position, we have maybe at least a dozen to 15 every year. It's a really, really great resource. And so just want to let you know that that's available. I'm not going to go into specifics today. Moving on, you've heard plenty about Match News. I won't say that yet again. Next slide is also something that you've heard already. In helping students avoiding poor site choices, you've heard about FIT. You've heard about not applying to highly competitive sites or all highly competitive sites. And you've heard about not applying or within a limited geographic area, although some students don't have a choice. I wanted to highlight those again, even though you've already heard about them. Next is student preparation. Again, you've heard about this a lot from Kimberly. I wanted to highlight one thing that I think is important here. One of the things that I've noticed is I think doctoral programs do a really good job of preparing their students sort of up to the point of interviews. So they help with essays, with applications, and then when the students get interviews, the response is, break a leg, good luck, hope it goes really well. And what I've noted, when I was an internship training director, we got a lot of applications. And so we could kind of pick the cream of the crop and interview a small portion of those. And one of the things that I always was fascinated by is that even with this really excellent group of students on paper, there was at least a quarter to a third every year who did not do well in the interview or bombed the interview. And so one of the things that I really learned from that, which I think is really important to understand, is that being a good graduate student, researcher, clinician just does not translate to the skills needed to be a good interviewee. And so I've been really encouraging doctoral programs to help with the interview preparation, to do mock interviews, to do other kinds of things, to not make the assumption that even your star students are going to go out and do a good job with the interviews. I'll get back to that next point. Also, just the whole concept, there's so much focus on hours for lots of reasons. Anything that you can do to help the students sort of keep that in perspective and to understand that training directors do not see hours as the end-all and be-all by any means. Another area that is, I think, important for you to know, and you've probably heard this from me before, is that when it comes to the time of rankings, it is really essential that students rank according to their true preferences, which simply means the place they want to be at most should be number one on their list. Now, I try and beat this into everybody's heads. I send out emails and things like that. I think students hear me, but when it comes down to ranking deadline and students feel the pressure and they're making difficult decisions, some of that really can go out the window. And I'm often surprised when I hear later about how many students don't pay attention to this. Well, not paying attention to this, as a student, you've put months and months and months of money and effort and time into this, and then to not submit your true rankings is just to stab yourself in the back at the last minute. So anything you can do to sort of drive this home, I think, would be really helpful. Related to that is to let students know, now, even though we do say that you should rank all the sites in which you are interested, if you really don't want to be at a site, you shouldn't rank it, because if it's on your list, you could be matched there, and if you're matched there, you're going. And some students get shocked by that every year. Okay, moving on.
Greg,
Yes.
I think we have an interesting question that relates to just what you presented there. Dr. Greer asked, rather than let a student register on their own, why can't the DCT have that authorization to allow them to apply?
That is a good point, and we have looked at that, and it's something that we might really implement at some point, where you have to have specific DCT authorization to actually register. Right now it is not that way, but point well taken. So talking a little bit about phase 2, obviously we have the devastation of not matching from phase 1, and students are going to come to you and they're going to want help in figuring out what happened. And I have a few sort of tips in terms of how to understand that. What I often look at is how many interview offers the student got. The average for 15 sites that they've applied to is about 7 interviews, give or take. If a student got substantially fewer than that, that strongly suggests to me that there's an issue with their application that they need to potentially take a look at. Or it could be letters of recommendation, other kinds of things. It could also be they applied to too many competitive sites. That's another possibility. On the other hand, if they received a sufficient number of offers and still didn't match, then we have most likely an issue with interviewing. The other thing to mention is that, and a lot of people don't know this, that it really is okay to request feedback from internship sites directly. And that can come from the student, and it can come from you, there's not a right way to do that. What I would say is that some internship programs will not be willing to give feedback for lots of reasons. Often they're instructed not to by their HR departments, but many will. And what I also find is that sometimes internship sites are a little more responsive to those requests when they come from DCTs, and actually maybe a little more candid with DCTs about their feedback. Another point that's related to all this is that I find that students' perceptions of their interviews are often inaccurate. I get lots of calls after the match, people saying to me, I had all these interviews and they went really, really well, and there must be something wrong with the match, the algorithm, a mistake was made. And so I've been taking those calls for 25 years. I get a couple of dozen every year. So what is that? 500 plus. There has never been a mistake in the algorithm, and I check everyone out with the matching service. But what I do also see when I look at how those students are ranked is very often their perceptions that they did well on interviewing are not at all supported by what I'm seeing in the rankings, just to say that. Okay. Post-match vacancy service, I already talked about it. I just want to say, though, the word clearinghouse, we haven't been using that for 13 years. Students actually, one of the reasons we changed that term is because students found it to be offensive. So if that is still part of your vocabulary, we ask that you start calling it the post-match vacancy service. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about failing internship. This happens, and I'm including resignations in here as well. This happens to about 50 to 70 students per year. So one of every 60 to 70 students each year will fail or resign from an internship. I do want to tell you there is absolutely life after this experience. As the person who until recently I handled all of these for APPIC, I can tell you that the vast majority of students who go through this are able to pick up the pieces, they reapply, and they are successful. But let me talk a little bit more about some of the nuts and bolts. First of all, if a student does want to leave an internship or is going to get terminated from an internship, APPIC has a match release process that we require. And the match policies state that you have to get APPIC's approval. And this is because we want to make sure that the student's rights are protected. We want to make sure that the internship program communicated with you and involved you as DCT, and we just want to make sure everything went correctly. So it's important to know about that. If a student of yours is facing this, make sure you get us involved. Now, once a student has, say, failed or resigned, what's your role? What are your tasks? Well, first of all, you get to identify what happened, and that is often not easy. Is it competencies? Are there health or mental health issues? Is there conflicts between the student and the site or the supervisors or the training director? Usually it's a combination of these things. And you're also going to get often very different perspectives from the student and from the internship as to what happened. So you kind of have to sort through that, but it is important to take the time to understand what happened, because then you can develop and implement a remediation plan that really addresses, and it's not always necessarily a remediation plan, it could be other things that are needed, but to really develop a strategy and a plan that really is going to meet the student's needs. I've seen some doctoral programs, they just have sort of a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to this, and I really don't think that works. You have to make sure the student successfully completes whatever plan or whatever intervention or whatever you decide to do before they reapply. And in terms of strategies for reapplying, what I suggest, well, first of all, a student has to disclose this in the professional conduct items on the APPIC that they were terminated or resigned. There is a place for a lengthy explanation, and that is essential. And this is not 1 or 2 sentences. I tell students that what goes here is a thoughtful, open, self-reflective summary for internship sites about what happened, about what you learned from what happened, about what you did about it, how did you grow, and why are you now ready for internship. A well-written, thoughtful, self-reflective explanation goes really, really far with internship training directors. And it goes even farther if the DCT and the letter writers back that up in their own writings, in their own letters, summarizing what happened. You want the internship site to have a consistent picture and an honest picture, of course, about exactly what happened. Okay, I think I'm at the end of time. I have some other things. I have another section of this presentation coming in a little bit, and I have some more information for you about what's available from APPIC in terms of getting more information, things like that. So I'm going to lump that into the next one when we get there. And I will turn it over to somebody.
That's me. I'm going to just talk for a couple minutes about the importance of communication between the academic DCT and the internship training directors. Thank you, Jeff. There we go. The next slide sort of has a description of the times when you can expect to communicate with internship training directors and sort of highlighting the importance of keeping this door open. So your first communication that you can expect is when the training director writes to your student to confirm the results of the match. That communication should also be copied to you. So that is step one. I believe that the accreditation policies say that you should also maintain regular communication. There isn't necessarily detail about who reaches out first, but I have sometimes received emails from academic DCTs around the time that interns are starting saying, hey, just wanted to let you know that I'm available if you need to talk to me. And I usually respond to those emails by saying, hopefully you will not hear from me again, with the exception of my mid-year progress letter and with a program completion letter. So those are the two other junctures in the year when we communicate with academic DCTs. So around December, January, or so, I will send a mid-year progress letter that is usually a summary of our evaluations and kind of speak to acquisition of competencies and tailor the letter obviously to each individual intern. And then I send a similar letter at the end of the year. The message here to students and to you all is that we are both motivated to support students to succeed in our respective programs. And so if there are difficulties that require more frequent communication, we should absolutely talk as frequently as is necessary. And if you have a student who matched, and as training directors, we're sort of sympathetic to the bind that academic DCTs find themselves in with being 100% candid in your readiness statement, but maybe you have a student who has struggled a little bit, but has never actually been on remediation, but they're not necessarily the best student you've ever sent into the match. If there are potential problems that you think we can anticipate, we would appreciate a heads up in a way that you feel comfortable providing it. And when in doubt, seek consultation. And Jeff is going to talk about that at the end. Next slide, Jeff, please. So there might be special circumstances that require communication. So if all is going well, you won't hear, we hopefully won't hear from each other. If you need any additional documentation, so sometimes I've written letters to support graduation prior to, so people can walk before June 30th, if that's when your internship is done, and graduations are often in May. So I'm happy to write those letters if requested. Sometimes students have requested letters that they're actually on internship in order to get tuition reimbursement or to not have to pay tuition. International students who are on F1 visas require that their internship letters are describing a training experience that's less than 365 days. So I might sometimes tweak my standard letter a little bit for international students. So please reach out to us. Let us what you need. Let us know what you need. We may reach out to you for verification of certain issues. So for example, in my program, students aren't allowed to do a research rotation unless they have defended their dissertations. And we will make exceptions if their defense has been submitted, but it hasn't orally been defended yet. So if the document has been submitted, so we might ask you to verify that the dissertation was submitted and is just awaiting an oral defense. During COVID-19, I did regular communications with our doc programs of the interns we had on site. So just sort of giving them updates on working in person versus virtually, safety precautions, how we're managing COVID more generally in our department. And I think that the training director sort of appreciated this mutual communication. And a note to site visits. So when I had my site visit most recently for my internship program, it was in person, it was just pre-pandemic. And I've always invited DCTs from Chicago area programs because they were able to come. And I can't tell you how favorably site visitors viewed that. And so I have also done the same for doc programs in Chicago when they've needed internship training directors to come and speak to their programs students. And so I feel like the pandemic has really sort of blown this open for all of us with opportunities for Zoom collaboration. So I just wanted to put that out there in case you haven't ever done this. This is an opportunity to think about it. All right, I think that is all I have. Is there one more, Jeff? Thank you. The last point I wanted to make here is to remind you that while you might have some reservations about seeking consultation from APPIC or communicating with the internship training director, some of the concerns are feeling like you don't want to interfere, hoping that things will get better, not having enough information about what's going on because you only heard the student's perspective. I wanted to highlight one, that FERPA in this case does not actually apply, because when your students register for the match, they consent to communication between the doc program and the internship program. So your students have consented, and therefore this communication is encouraged and sanctioned and necessary. Greg is going to speak to this in a little bit, but we have shared responsibilities as gatekeepers for the profession. And when you send students who are not ready for internship into the match and they match at our sites, the responsibility for gatekeeping then is sort of kicked down the road to us. And we just want to make sure that we are doing this collaboratively. Greg is going to talk about match DPA policies and APPIC policies regarding attesting to readiness. Should we take a 5-minute break?
5-minute break.
Come back. All right. Thank you, everyone. It is 12:06 Central Time. We will see you back at 12:12 Central Time. Welcome. Greg, you are up next for our section on policies.
All right. All right, here we go. Well, there's nothing that people look forward to more than a policy presentation in the third hour. But I will try and make this as painless as possible. So I'm going to go through some of the important policies, both match policies, DPA policies that we think are important. So let's talk first about APPIC match policies. This sort of goes without saying, but the policies do talk about providing accurate information to internship sites, of course. One of the things that you may not know, though, is that it is incumbent upon students and DCTs that if there's a substantive change in a student situation, that we require that sites be notified about that, whether it's before or after the match. Now, we're not talking about, oh, my hours were off by 3 or something like that. You know, something significant. A student runs into a significant problem at a practicum, fails a practicum, gets put on probation, those kinds of things. At the very least, in those kinds of situations, you do need to let internship sites know about that. And at the same time, internship sites have the same responsibility to you and your students. They need to accurately describe their programs. They need to notify your students about changes to those programs that may occur. And they are expected to do what they say they are going to do. The next thing I'd like to highlight is the interview notification requirement, and this applies to Phase 1. Internship sites are required to provide a date by which applicants will be notified as to whether or not they receive an interview. The recommended date is December 15th, but, is it the 15th or the 1st? Now I can't remember. 15th? 15th, thank you. But many sites, sites can choose whatever date they want. They just have to publish it in the directory so that students know when to expect that. This is not a requirement in Phase 2 or in the post-match and does not include open houses, but it is a requirement. If a student does not hear back from a site by that date, I suggest that they wait until the next day and then contact the site and inquire about their status. And if they still don't hear, it is fine for students to contact me. I will follow up with sites without telling the site the name of the student or the program or anything, and just inquire about why there may be an issue with their notification. Another requirement that APPIC has of internship sites is that after any match or any placement, that they need to send an appointment agreement to the student and to you as DCT within 7 days after that match or placement. And it includes things like stipend and dates of the internship and things like that. We just want them to get that in writing quickly. And I think if you don't get that, that would definitely be something to follow up with the site about. Communication, and this is a different kind of communication that Shona was talking about. This is about the communication of ranking information. Now, the match policies do not allow students or sites to communicate ranking information with each other. So that means students cannot say things like, "You are my first choice," or "Where will you be ranking me?" And I even encourage students just not to make comparative statements, so to not state, comparative against other places. So don't say something like, this is the best place of all the interviews that I've done, where you're kind of hinting at rankings. That's the kind of thing that we want people not to do. But this policy is really misinterpreted to be much more broad than it really is. People overinterpret it to think that they can't talk to each other during certain times, and that's just not true. Other than ranking information, it is perfectly fine for a student to contact a site at any time, for a site to contact a student, students to ask questions. It's also okay for students to be enthusiastic. They can say things like, I think this rotation is fantastic, or I think I'd be really happy as an intern. It's not about rankings. So you can be genuine and enthusiastic and excited without sharing ranking information. So that's something that's important for you to make sure that your students understand. Sites in general are very good about it. Not always, but they're generally very good about it. And I do get calls when a student goes to a place and says, "You're my number one choice." That gets their attention. I usually get a call when that happens because they feel like, because the student has violated a policy and they want to know what they should do about that. So, moving on. There's another policy about public statements about accreditation. And if we go back about 7 or 8 years before this policy existed, we had a problem because internship sites that weren't accredited understood the huge disadvantage that it put them in terms of competitiveness for applicants. And they got quite liberal with their comments about the anticipation of accreditation or what they were planning to do, which unfortunately did not always come to fruition. So we had too many situations where students would be matched to a place based on a promise of accreditation that really never happened. So we rein that in with this. It's not new. It's with this policy. Now what we permit is sites can talk about events that have already happened in the accreditation process. They submitted a self-study, were awarded a site visit, or a site visit was completed. But they're not permitted to talk about the future or what they anticipate. They're also not permitted to say these really misleading statements like, "Our program was designed to meet accreditation standards," which was quite popular for a while. None of that is permitted anymore. And when sites talk about this, they're also required to have a disclaimer indicating there's just no guarantees that sites will ultimately be accredited. And with what's going on right now, my understanding is that there's a lot of delays in the accreditation process. These processes are going on for a year and more, much longer than that. For some sites, any kind of statements, I would be very, very careful. If accreditation is important to your doctoral program, which hopefully it is, and you want your students to go to accredited programs, I would be very, very careful about students applying to non-accredited internship programs with the hope that those programs will ultimately be accredited, because I think that hope is, at least in the current environment, is quite limited. And with these comments, I also want to say that I think some doctoral programs do permit students to apply to non-accredited programs, or they may allow students to do that later in the process, and that's totally fine. No issue with that at all. We just want to make sure that that students understand that it takes a lot to get accredited, and that these timelines can really go on a very long time. Okay, so I'm going to move on and talk more about what we call our DPA policies, and hopefully all of you got an email from Shona yesterday announcing some changes that we made to those policies. I'm going to summarize some of the more significant changes, but really encourage you to go back and read that specifically. We defined, again, we've talked a little bit about this, a student may participate in the match only if they've met your criteria for readiness, they're not currently on probation or remediation, and the student has been deemed ready by your doctoral program. And this is now, again, it's in policy, so if you have a student that feels like they want to insist that they have the right to apply for internship, whether you like it or not, the very least you can go back to our policies, which basically now say, no, you can't, that it really is up to the doctoral program. And that it's also up to the doctoral program as to which sites your students may apply to or rank. That's always been our approach. That is now written in policy. I hear from students every year who are just so offended that their doctoral program has the audacity to be limiting the places to which they apply. Doctoral programs are expected to monitor match registrations, which I talked about earlier. We also strongly discourage doctoral programs from requiring separate contracts with internship programs. This is currently very rare, but there are a few programs that do that. We really discourage that. We also discourage internship sites very strongly from doing that. If this is something that you do, you should let me know so we can talk about it, because there are very specific disclosure requirements that have to happen in advance of the match, so that internship sites know that this is going to be required of them. Next point I think you've heard a lot about already is about active communication, and I just had a little quote from the policies that we consider the doctoral internship experience to be a collaboration between the internship site and the doctoral program. And I think we could be more creative about this. I know one of the things that I did, not to just toot my own horn, but is when I was training director, I would call DCTs maybe about a month before their students arrived on my site for internship. And since the match was over, we could have a more open conversation about the students' strengths and areas of growth, their training needs and things like that. I just found that to be enormously helpful in getting just kind of a better understanding of their students earlier on. So I think there's a lot of really innovative ways this kind of communication that could happen that we're not doing right now. And then the next point I've already made of just about when a student fails or resigns from an internship and what the program's responsibilities are specifically. So won't go over that again. Okay, this ties back to the last presentation. I told you that I would share some resources for you. So this is blatant self-promotion right here, since I am a co-author on this APEC's workbook. I will say I get no money from this, so I have no investment in whether this sells any copies or not, other than wanting APECs gets the benefits from this, so certainly wanting to support APECs. But I wanted you to know about this workbook because I'm sure it's my bias, but this has been through, I think, 6 or 7 different versions now. It says 4th edition, but there have been more than that. And we've really refined this and have a lot of good information for students about every aspect of the process. And we have a new chapter in this edition, which is specifically advice for DCTs and how to help your students. And some of you may know Carol or Mitch, my co-presenters. Mitch is a DCT. Both are former APEX chairs. And so I would really, again, recommend this as much as you can take a biased recommendation. Also want to show you 2 websites, APPIC and NMS website, very quickly, just to show you where to get more information about the match, because sometimes people have a hard time finding it. APPIC.org, internships menu, there on the right side, you have a little sub menu. If you choose about the match at the very top, you're going to get this menu. And this is pretty much from the APPIC website, your directory into getting into all the information that we have. The top 2 links, introduction and frequently asked questions, are really comprehensive about the match. There's match policies, as you can see, match statistics, which I'm going to get to in a second. And then we have separate sections on phase 2 and post-match. And a lot of DCTs don't really pay much attention to this unless they have a student in phase 2, and then all of a sudden they need this information. And where it talks about instructions for applicants or something is for applicants, it's really for applicants and you as well. I mentioned the match statistics page, and we have 24 years of statistics, more than you'll ever want to read on that page, but there are a couple of things I just wanted to make you aware of. We have reports on match rates, and this is how every doctoral program in the country has done in the match over the past 20 years, I think that's total. Yeah. And also we have survey results. And I just want to show you very briefly a little bit. So I've de-identified this. This is just a sample doctoral program from some university somewhere. And this is the information that we publish. We have the number of registered applicants each year. The line in bold is a summary for the 9-year period. It shows the percent matched, percent not matched, percent withdrawn, and it also shows the percentage of matched applicants who match to accredited and non-accredited internships. So this is information that we provide to the public that comes specifically from our match data. And again, it's something that you should know exists. I update this every couple of years to add the additional years. Every time I do it, I always send an email to you and you can look over your numbers and you can compare them to your numbers, and we can clear up any discrepancies that might be there. The other thing I want to show you is I mentioned there are applicant surveys. We do an applicant survey every year. We don't have every year up on the website, but we have a number of years, and there's just a wealth of really helpful information in there. And I just picked out one item, but this is practicum hours, medians, means, standard deviations for clinical counseling school psych programs. So the top section you can see is doctoral intervention hours. You can see those means, and the bottom section is doctoral assessment hours. So this is just one piece of all the questions that I ask students every year and the results that I think you'll find very helpful. So I think it's definitely worth a read. The other place that's important is the National Matching Services website. And if you go to the main page, you can see there's a link specifically for doctoral programs. And you're going to get on the left side there lots of information. You can read about the algorithm if that kind of thing excites you. The Nobel Prize winning algorithm, I'll say. This is also where you access your list of students. It's where you get your students' match results and other kinds of links that will be helpful. So again, there's good information on both websites. Just knowing where to find it, I think, is really key. And that wraps it up for me. So back
Thank you,
to
Greg.
somebody. Thanks.
Actually, Jeff is going to finish up for us today by sharing with you one of our most important resources, and that is APPIC's problem consultation process and service. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Shona. Give me a second here. My menu went away.
So we'll
There it
probably
is.
spend
Okay.
about 10 minutes on this and then have some time for questions at the end.
Okay, sounds good. As Greg and a number of people have mentioned, this is the final hour of the workshop, and it's nothing better than to talk about problems, huh? So APPIC does have a problem consultation service. A little bit of history behind this is that many decades ago, or it feels like many decades ago, when I was on the board, there were very few formal complaints, 2, 3, 4 year maybe kind of thing. But there are lots of questions being asked and problems being presented. So APPIC came up with the informal problem resolution process, IPR. And we quickly realized that name needed to be changed. It had to become informal problem consultation service as opposed to resolution. There weren't always a resolution. So all these requests that come into APPIC for this informal problem consultation service, which there were about during the peak year 2020, during COVID, we had about 380 IPCs, informal problem consultations, compared to the year before, which was about 100 more than the year before. So COVID brought in all kinds of fun things to deal with. All this information is confidential. This is a consultation service. It is not a determining service. So we consult with whoever submits that request for consultation, and it's informal, and it's trying to help the person who submitted it what options they might want to consider. That form is located on the website there, just as Greg showed you there, appic.org. You'll see the headline up there, problem consultation, and you can be able to complete that form. I triage those and send some of those to the board members, our APPIC coordinator, our match coordinator as it's fit there. Typically, the students were given those policies about due process and grievance during orientation, never thinking they'd ever use them. So we just remind them to go back and look at those policies, to take a good look at that, to identify some specific requirements or forms that might need to be filled out, or deadlines, dates that they need to follow. And we almost always, when consulting, well, pretty much always, that they need to consult with their DCT about what's going on, what options they might be able to help them identify. Sometimes running it by their cohort, their issues, sometimes running it by trusted former supervisors have all been very helpful kinds of things to do. So there are some themes to these IPC requests that we've had over the last 10 years or so. The number one issue for the last 2 years has been competence and professionalism. Now, as Greg said, it's less than 2%, 2.5% that get dismissed or resign. So out of 4,000 students, that's 100 or so, maybe 200 or 80, as he said, 1 or 2%. So it's not a huge amount, but we think the IPC and the process assist with students identifying what their resources are, and that these remediation plans that they fear because it feels like that they're failing at something is really a roadmap to success. The program's trying to identify what concrete anchors they're looking at, what the remediation process involves, including the timelines and the expected outcomes of that time period. So we try to help them reframe a little bit with that issue, knowing that no one wants to get one of these or be put on a remediation plan, but sometimes 95% of the time they can be helpful for the students to get back on track. The other issues are problems at the training sites. They might have conflicts with the training director, the supervisor. The program may not have had a lot of truth in advertising. They're not doing what they had presented in their written materials, their public materials. So students will contact us about that. Our students have illness and disability. Obviously, you have that up there twice, but it's just once. There's ethics violations, dishonesty, misconduct. It's certainly related to number one above there. So the students can be dismissed from an internship site, but and not be allowed to be back on the site because of something like this, but they still are subject to due process according to APPIC's requirements. The student doesn't have to appear on campus to go through the due process. So APPIC kind of has that final word on this process here. Typically, of course, legal, ethical issues are going to trump that, so to speak. But they do have to go through that process. That match release is an important thing. Just like Greg said, make sure that all three parties are on the same page: the training director, the DCT, and the trainee. If there's some miscommunication, we try to sort that out prior to any final action being taken. And of course, parenting and family issues are a big issue. Match applications, interviews, how they rank, those kinds of things. And then APPIC policy, other things, COVID-19 for sure. So those are the common kinds of issues. Just to give you a comparison here, the blue is 2019, the orange is 2020, the gray is 2021, and the yellow here is 2022. That's just for date. That just shows the approximate percentage of the IPCs that are being submitted. So you'll see here for parental leave, a real big issue there again in 2020 when COVID. Parents were wanting to be protective of their kids, of course, and their parents as well, kind of thing. You'll see a little bit of trend here on supervisor conflicts that have increased over the years. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but that's a good manuscript for TEP somewhere. Assessment skills, there's been a slight increase in concern over the years there as well. And then even more so, the competencies over the last couple of years, as I stated earlier, seem to be a huge issue there. It doesn't mean they're incompetent. It just means they're coming with less skills sometimes, both in assessment and in professional skill kinds of things there. And we're certainly a good hypothesis that the last 2 years, they have had less practical on-site training kind of thing. And those issues come up during the internship training year. So those outcomes are typically that we help them identify what those concerns of the training program are. We may intervene with the training program, but only with the permission of the trainee or the person who submitted that. That's something rare that I do, and strongly encourage and support and guide the student on how they can effectively do that. But we will become involved. We certainly remind them of the due process and the grievance procedures that they may not have, or that they may have forgotten about. We do not reverse decisions made by the program unless there's something egregious or the program falls apart or something like this. There might be something that to assist with that. But if it falls apart, the student really doesn't want to be there anyway. And we do work with the students, especially Greg works with the students to get them placed in other sites. A little harder 10 years ago than it is today. So there are some sites that do not have more than one intern, which is a concern with that site, and we work with them as well. Again, we've identified those resources. We make sure they talk with a DCT. They can certainly talk with the ADA office. ADA accommodations are not retroactive, so they need to get those in immediately whenever they can. Or there may be Title IX or EEOC issues. They certainly can consult with other trust faculty members there, as I said earlier. So, of course, if there's not a satisfactory resolution, they can move that on to a more formal complaint with APPIC through our formal complaint process. They can also contact APA, our CPA. They can contact the State Board of Licensure. We try to get this resolved before it gets to that. And that sort of speaks to how many actual formal ASART complaints we've had. Most years there's 2, 3, maybe 4, except for the COVID year when there were 10. So it's one of those aspects there that COVID has brought about. But we do think, I strongly believe that problem consultation has reduced the number of formal complaints and has helped students resolve what they need to do. So thanks for joining us. We'll be sending you out an evaluation and CE credit for this, but I think we have lots of time here for questions. And so I'll open it up to the floor and we'll try to moderate those. I know there's a number in the chat, and I think Shona has monitored those, and I certainly have a couple of those too.
Thank you, Jeff. Actually, Kimberly is going to go again
for
a couple minutes with a really exciting development to share with you all. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
So this is a change that is going to roll out in 23-24. So not this cycle, but the cycle, 2 cycles from now. So what we'll be doing is moving the APPIC Practicum hours accrual end date up 1 month to 10/1 from 11/1. Here's the issue. So, there's aspects of this application process that are really stressful, time intensive, and we're always looking for ways to reduce the burden on everyone involved. One of the most common questions I receive as APPIC coordinator from both DCTs and students is the hours estimation process through November 1st. Students waste a ton of time trying to figure out, is patient X going to show up? Can I count them in my estimated hours? It's just crazy, the focus of time on that. Then there's some DCTs don't feel comfortable verifying their students' hours that are estimated. So then they wait until the very last minute to verify their students' hours, which adds to the bogging down of the APPIC portal when the students are forced to wait until last minute to apply. And then from the internship training director perspective, they're always wondering, well, are those last month of estimated hours even accurate? So, and one of the things that APPIC is really committed to, and I know other stakeholders in the community, is really trying to find ways to shift this hyper focus on hours as the most important criterion. And so by having this focus on, you must estimate your hours for these last 4 weeks, it really sends an indirect message that, every hour counts, every quarter of an hour counts. So this is small way to start shifting that focus to competency. So looking at the reason we chose October 1st is I went back, looked at the actual APPIC DCT verification data, and 99.25% of students had their APPIs verified after October 1st. So since almost every DCT is already verifying their students' hours after October 1st, if we move the end date for hours verification up to October 1st, we're essentially removing any need to estimate those hours altogether. Here's a graphic. So in 2021, this is all, so for the approximately 4,000 students, this is where when they had their APPIs verified. Sorry. So you can see that 2,600 students had their APPIs verified in that last week before that first big deadline of November 1st. And so only 31 APPIs were verified before October 1st. So the pros of this is we just remove all that anxiety and time for students estimating their hours. We reduce the student confusion about how to enter the estimated hours, because there's actually 2 ways to do it. So if you're using time to track, if you have appointments in the system already, the system will calculate those in your estimated hours, but then the student could not realize that and inadvertently also add those hours to the summary tab. So there's a way to accidentally double dip. Reduce, for the DCTs who don't want to verify hours that are estimated, you can just reduce that anxiety and eliminate that anxiety. Potentially, if some of the DCTs were holding off until the end to verify their applications, but you had a really savvy student who was ready to go October 15th, perhaps we reduce some of the bogging down, the overtaxing of the APPIC system right at that big deadline. And then I just think this is a small but important way to decrease our obsessive focus on the importance of practicum hours over competency. The biggest con I can think of is students are going to be anxious that they have 4 last week of verified hours. The hours will still be there. They'll just move them to those anticipated hours section. And so this is one of the reasons, especially with COVID and people's hours have already been impacted. We're not going to roll it out for this cycle. Let's give people a year and a half here to get used to the fact that they're going to have 4 less weeks of hours accrual. It'll also give us time to talk to training directors that if you're a program that does set hours minimums, that start thinking about how you might adjust your hours minimums to consider these 4 less weeks. So, and this had unanimous support of the various stakeholders at a recent CCTC meeting. And so I'm really excited just because I get so many questions about this. Just is super confused.
I didn't realize until I saw that slide how many DCTs verify in the week before November 1st. So I feel for you all, especially if you have, a lot of students going into the match.
Mm-hmm. And children who want to trick or treat.
Yes. So we have 15 minutes left. Thank you everyone for being so timely with your presentations. That gives us time for questions. So Kimberly, if we take the big topics sequentially, mm-hmm. It seems like the first one was your reference to paid experiences counting as practicum hours. So if perhaps expound on that, that'd be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And I do get this question a lot, so I'm happy we're talking about it. So APPIC doesn't dictate any criterion to DPAs about what is required to count something as a practicum. This is something that you have specified in your self-studies to APA, CPA, and so the payment is irrelevant. So it's just a bonus if someone gets paid for something that you're sanctioning as a practicum. That's great. But these situations that our students come to us all the time, like, oh, I got this job, I'm being paid through so-and-so's grant, I'm going to be administering these assessments. So as a clinical research assistant, or I got a job in the community working at eating disorders, doing groups. Whether or not you sanction as a practicum is whether that situation, whether that practica, job or clinical research position meets your criteria that you specify in your materials to the accreditation agency of your program. So in my program, for example, as I mentioned before, half the students that come to me with clinical jobs don't meet our criteria and I don't sanction it. The other half do, and I require them to, there's steps. So we have a supplemental practicum contract that has to get signed, that the agency or research project has to agree to provide XYZ supervision and training. There's evaluations. And so it's really where your professional judgment comes into play about whether it meets your criteria as a practicum. But payment is not a piece of it. It's just a bonus.
Does anyone have follow-up questions to what Dr. Hill to what Kimberly just said? Yeah. Okay. That took out a chunk of questions from the chat.
Mm-hmm. And
there is a follow-up question.
Oh, okay.
There used to be a place in the application where students could write about previous work experiences and behavioral health. Does it still exist?
It still exists, and it's called non-practicum clinical work experience. And so it's just a big text box where students can, I expanded the character limit, so you can essentially cut and paste from your CV and just list your experiences if that's the way you'd like to do it. It's already formatted in a beautiful way, so don't reinvent the wheel. That's what I tell my students.
There were lots of questions about the functionality of allowing DCTs of linking the DCT approval of match registration. Can it come from the DCT rather than the
Yeah, I think that I personally think it's a great idea. I think that there might have been a history of concern for that we don't want to disadvantage an applicant from being able to register for the match if the DCT is just not responsive if for some reason. I think this is something we could definitely explore as a board about whether and with our various vendors NMS and liaison to see what kind of functionality we could build if this was something we decided to move forward with. Just an idea off the top of my head, we could potentially, as after you submit, yes, I verify this applicant, perhaps it sends an authorization code to the student to then go register for NMS. I have no idea about the technology and all of that, but that would be kind of snazzy. So certainly something I would love to take to the board and explore with our vendors and see what's possible.
Kimberly, there's another follow-up question about hours and whether non-prac hours can count towards minimum hours for internship.
I think practicum hours is just the code word for program sanctioned. So that's why I have students in doing clinical research or clinical trials. They're well supervised, well trained. Even though they have an official title as clinical research assistant, if it meets my criteria as practicum, we label it as a supplemental practicum, they do an agreement. So I think just in being able to speak the language to internship training directors, I think it's great if you can try to label things in that way if you're, because then it's confusing. We're like, well, wait, where did these practicum hours come from? Because that's what the APPIC is about, your practicum hours.
So, I'm wondering, since we have time, if it would be more helpful if people turn on their mics and ask questions, and also turn on their cameras. We'd love to see your faces in this in these last 10 minutes. Hello.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So my question is, and this has been an issue that's come up at our program about our students seeking employment and whether this should be sanctioned practicum hours and such. And one of the conversations that have come around this is whether if we allow for certain students' employments fitting the criteria for practicums, does this ruin or impact the equity of practicum opportunities that were more formally sanctioned and offered if students can find employment opportunities in this way? And I recognize that maybe this isn't the correct area or platform to talk about this, but there is some conversations about if students have certain employment opportunities and connections, and those are practicum opportunities that they can get that are not available to other students.
I think that answer, I mean, it's just my perspective, is that would probably have great variability on your geographic region. So where I am, for example, in the Bay Area, there's just a plethora of job opportunities, practicum, and I could imagine in smaller or rural areas that maybe those clinical opportunities are harder to come by. So I feel like that's more of a localized issue. That might be more of a program level decision.
And I wonder if programs also have policies about whether they allow their students to have outside employment at all.
Right. So some have stipend, some of your some programs definitely do. You cannot moonlight. So.
Thank you. Dr. Phillips.
Hi, first of all, thank you. This has been a terrific panel. So thanks to all of the panelists. It's been really helpful for me. You can tell me if this is the right platform to ask this question. Sometimes we have students who have gotten some clinical experience in let's say a terminal master's, and then they're admitted into our doctoral program. And understandably, they want to count those hours. And then they're asking me, well, are you going to verify my hours from this other program? Mm-hmm. And I'm really stuck as to how to deal with this. My first reaction is, no, I cannot. I couldn't possibly verify hours from another program. But do you have any guidance on this?
It's a great question. I also get that one quite frequently, so you're not alone. And so the important thing for the students to know is that they should go ahead and list them as their terminal hours. We have a little box as DCTs of whether or not we verify them. I don't know how much training directors really take that, whether or not we verify them is important. My students match whether I verify them or not. So I'm not sure how important that is. And so I think it's your comfort level on, I always just ask students to submit the documentation from their terminal master's program of what hours they've received. And if it's not well documented in terms of types of supervision, degree of supervision, that type of thing, then I just don't check the box. And if it is really well done and I feel like it's high quality, then I verify them. But it's really your judgment and your comfort level. And it's okay if you don't check the box. It's not gonna seal the deal. But I think the biggest, students don't understand that they can go ahead and list them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Clark.
Hi. So my question is in a situation where a DCT also has obviously other roles, potentially has served as a clinical supervisor, is a dissertation chair and mentor. Do training directors tend to prefer just to have the DCT focus on the verification and the statements regarding strengths and areas for growth and not provide a separate standardized reference form in a different role? Or is it okay to provide those statements about the applicant as part of the DCT verification and then in addition serve as one of the reference writers?
I can answer that as an internship training director. I think that it is fine to do both. In fact, if you don't write a letter as the student's dissertation chair, I think you're doing your student a disservice because you have a unique perspective. And so what I see most frequently is that people do both.
Thank you.
Dr. Staples?
Yes, hello. You may not be able to answer this question, so I understand, but I've been getting a lot of questions from students about how many interviews will be in person versus virtually so they can plan ahead financially. So I don't know if you have a answer to that question.
Great question. It's perfect timing because we're putting together a manuscript that addresses that issue to some degree. We don't really have a fortune teller in the office to tell us exactly what it's going to be, but we can tell you what it has been for the last 2 years. And the vast majority of both internship training directors and applicants have seen the light that the virtual interviews are a positive kind of thing. So I think APPIC doubts that it's ever going to go away. There will probably be some sites that continue to offer both and some sites that continue to only offer in person. But I think those last two categories are going to be the smallest categories. Shown as
Kimberly and I are working on the training director survey for 2022 as we speak, and hopefully we'll have more data for you as in the next couple of months.
That's going to internship training directors.
Yes, that's going to internship training directors. As an internship training director myself, we always did in person. We've done virtual for the last couple of years. Do I like it? Not entirely. Do I think that they're sufficient for what we need them to do? Yes. And can I imagine ever going back? No. Just from an equity and social justice perspective, I really can't envision in good conscience asking people to come in, even though I don't experience them as satisfying as I did if we had them come in person.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Other questions? I don't see any other hands raised that I have missed, and we are
It's
right.
11 o'clock.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your participation and your attendance. We will put all our slides together in one slide deck and send them out to you. They will also be available for download on the website. And Jeff, if you want to just say a couple words about